All right, so this is Ezra. I'm actually pulling in chapter 4 from the last time. Um, if you're looking for sort of deep theological insights, this may or may not be the video for you. This is it's a history and it's a confusing history. So this video is mainly on how to interpret that history. So you're just not like, what am I even reading about? It jumps around a bit and it gets a little confusing that way. So that's what this video is going to be, historically understanding what they're reading about in Ezra from chapters 4 to 7. So Ezra 4, as it opens, basically, Zerubbabel and Yeshua are trying to build, and the verse actually says, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin, those are the two tribes that were in Jerusalem, heard that the returned exiles were building, they approached them and said, hey, let us help, right? And Zerubbabel and Yeshua say, no, thanks, we're good, right? So it seems kind of weird to say, hey, we all should worship your God. Why would they reject help? You can tell by the beginning of the sentence, the enemies of. So this is likely people, whether they were originally Hebrew or not, is kind of beside the point. But they say they worship God, but they also worship other gods, right? Which is what most of Israel's past is. It's they never really abandon God. What they do is they just bring in all kinds of other gods, and he's one of them, right? So that's what goes on. So they're facing some opposition. So that is during the rule of Darius, right? King Darius, the Persian king, and he says, "Hey, by the way, you can go and rebuild or basically, they are rebuilding the temple with Cyrus's permission." And they sort of run into opposition. Now, between chapter 6 and 7, so a little bit down the road, we're in chapter 4 here. Between 6 and 7, after they rebuild the temple, there's a 50-year gap before Ezra arrives, the namesake of the book, right? So there's a 50-year gap there where Ezra arrives. And during that time, there were some letters back and forth, some other opposition to uh, God's chosen people about rebuilding all of Jerusalem, right? So this right here, chapter 4, is talking about rebuilding the temple, which is kind of part of that, but not really the walls of the city or whatever. But there is some resistance that happens in that 50-year span, right? The author of this book pulls that in right here in verses 6 to 23, which chronologically is painful. Like you're trying to read this and it doesn't make any sense, right? Thematically, it kind of makes sense. Basically, what he's saying is, hey, by the way, here's another time where they faced opposition as well, right? Toss it in. This happened too, and then he goes back to the original story. So understanding that as you're reading this makes it a bit messy in terms of that way. That happens in a number of places in the Bible. They are not as worried about chronological story time. Like for us now in this time frame, we're sort of like, how could you possibly that must be a mistake? But clearly for them, the theme and the events that are important and how you describe them are more important than the chronological order. So we're just about to, I think, might be next week maybe, read where the Table of Nation appears, and everybody has their different languages before the Tower of Babel, where God splits up the languages. So there's a number of places that happens, right? And that makes sense in context because they're going through the descendants of Noah, and that kind of makes sense at that place, right? So anyway, this verse 6 to 23, completely out of context. So it goes into the reign of Ahasuerus, whatever that is. I don't even know how to say that one. But that's actually a sort of another name for Xerxes. And it goes into Artaxerxes, which follows him. So Xerxes is actually the king in Esther. So if you're trying to sort of parallel books, so after the temple is rebuilt, there's that 50-year span. And in that span, before Ezra comes, is when the story of Esther is told. So clearly, there's still a lot of Jews there. You can see Ezra brings some more back, and it's not like they've all come back to the Holy Land at that point. So there's still a lot of them there, and that's when the story of Esther happens. If you're trying to sort of chronologically put these together, and then verse 24 brings you back to Darius, back to them building the temple. So there's this interlude. Hey, by the way, this also happened where the emperor doesn't really reject, but he kind of sort of says, put on hold this rebuilding of the whole city type of thing. But that's after the temple's already been built. So it's out of context in terms of chronological. Chapter 5 and 6 come out, and those are actually that whole section, the 6 to 23. Well, the beginning of it, first couple sentences are Hebrew, but it turns to Aramaic actually there for all the way through most of chapter 6 before going back to Hebrew. Um, because they're letters, mostly letters written in Aramaic. So the whole piece, even the sentences in between at that point, are sort of in Aramaic, just because the bulk of the letters are all Aramaic, and it even talks about the translating them. Anyways, chapter 5 and 6, basically another sort of chronology. Haggai and Zechariah actually prophesy to these people, and they mention them specifically. So both Haggai and Zechariah prophesy to Zerubbabel and Yeshua and say, hey, get started rebuilding that temple. So they had sort of stopped. They had faced some resistance, and they were kind of like, what do I do? Do I know? Whatever. And Haggai and Zechariah come to them and say, hey, you need to rebuild the temple. And surprisingly enough, they listen. They start rebuilding. So chapter 6, the whole beginning of that is letters back and forth where they start rebuilding. The locals sort of say, hey, by the way, did you know this was happening? And Zerubbabel and Yeshua say, hey, we have permission. King Cyrus gave us permission. So these people are annoying us. They're trying to stop us, but we already were given permission. Just look that up. So Darius does look it up. He goes and he says, you know what? They're right. Cyrus did give him permission. So therefore, let them finish. Let them do whatever they need to do. And into chapter 6, 14 to 22, it's finished. It goes through the dedication process, and things are in the temple, at least, back to normal. So they have got sacrifices going again. They've got priests and Levites there, and things are kind of moving along from that point of view. Then you've got that 50-year gap that we mentioned. And you know that because there's a time stamp at the beginning of chapter 7. It says, I think it's the 20th year of Artaxerxes. But that gap happens, right? And then in chapter 7, it talks about Ezra the scribe, who's sort of a Torah expert, right? And Artaxerxes says, I'm going to send you back, right? So he's not really building the temple. The physical temple is there. Jerusalem, we're going to find out when we get to Nehemiah, the city itself isn't the greatest. The walls are kind of falling down, whatever. And that's where those letters going back and forth, we're talking about, should we rebuild it? Should we not rebuild it? That little thing happened in the gap. Well, right now they're still not rebuilt. But what you can see with this, with saying Ezra going back, is they physically built the building, but clearly God's people had not returned to that area, right? So that is, like I said, the time where Esther sort of pops in to that in between. And this time period, they were there, but they didn't really take over as a people. God's people were not back. The Hebrews, the Israels, the Jews were not rebuilt as a people there. So Artaxerxes sends Ezra with a bit of a letter saying, go back and build those people up, appoint people in charge, presumably underneath the Persians. They're not like making their own laws, but they're sort of saying, I want you to go back, rebuild your people, and make things happen and be orderly so that you can, I'm sure, so you can give taxes and other things, but we don't want the chaos, right? And then at the end of chapter 7, the last couple lines, the first person account of Ezra begins, where he sort of says, hey, by the way, this is great. He goes into the first person. So I took courage because I was strengthened by the hand of the Lord my God, and I gathered the Israelite leaders to return with me. So chapter 8 is where it really starts to discuss that return, where Ezra is going to try to rebuild the people and teach them the law and get things organized. So that is the big picture of chapters 4 to 7. A little bit confusing chronologically what's going on. If you don't have a Bible that sort of fills in some of those gaps, some study Bibles do that. But hopefully that helps you as you're reading. Good luck.